Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Vicki, for making time to talk with myself and Cassandra today. I wonder if we can start the conversation by unpacking a little bit and deconstructing this idea of self care. What does that mean for frontline workers?
Cool. I just want to start by saying I'm on the territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh people. And I have a long history with the Dr. Peter Center and the harm reduction movement, mostly through ACT UP and Queer Nation and fighting the tyranny of AIDS and the massacre of that. And I just want to have a nod to queer folks because I'm straight and cisgendered. As an activist, like so much, I was informed so greatly by ACT UP and Queer Nation, in particular in San Francisco, where I was living at the time, and then here. And just so much of what we know about harm reduction from my perspective comes from queer and trans communities, always communities of struggle that have taken care of each other, but just how much the present catastrophe that we're in of what gets called overdosing, which is not overdosing. And it's not just drug poisoning, it's death by bad drug policy, but how much our resistance to that owes, we're on the shoulders of giants. And in particular, the queer community and the fight that we had in these territories around AIDS has so informed me and informed this. So I just wanted to start by acknowledging that. So it's an honor for me to be speaking with you, Seff and Cassandra. Big respect for all you shoulder up. So let's talk about self-care. So anything that starts with self doesn't got me in it at all. I have no interest in that shit, right? So I'm a person who comes from communal culture, like most of us. I come from an Irish clan, and I believe in sacredness and belonging and bringing people in. I never tried to take myself too seriously. Things like self-esteem, self-care, self-respect. You don't esteem yourself. Esteem is a social process. You are esteemed by others. It is arrogant to think you're self-esteeming, right? This is this whole mythology that people pick themselves up by their bootstraps and built themselves. It's like, who are you standing on? You're standing on the backs of, women, queer folks, people of color, indigenous people. Whose territory are you on? And Black people who are enslaved and in this country, indigenous people who are enslaved that built the economy that we're on, right? Just thinking about all of self-psychology is really lined up with capitalism. And this rugged individualism is absolutely, it's a patriarchal capitalist construct, right? That's class stuff. So I just have a problem with anything in psychology. I mean, I have a PhD in psychology. I just think psychology's got a lot to answer for and has created a lot more harm. It's not a neutral project. And so my job has always been to try to keep teams alive in this work. But what I've learned and what's been useful is not anything I learned from psychology or in academia. It's been from social justice movements and from direct action activism, right? And so there's never a self in that. It's always about collective, right? So just the very beginning of like self-care, thinking about self-care in that kind of way, it's problematic on a bunch of fronts. But if we just look at the present moment, self-care is really directed by white supremacist capitalist agenda. What you're supposed to do as a worker for, quote, self-care lines up almost perfectly with what rich white women do who don't have to do paid work outside the house. So many of the workers I'm working with are like, when do you do self-care? I have no time for this. So it has to be people who have enough time for leisure, right? And then the other thing is, what we're replicating in this capitalist project is often body maintenance and body policing. It's to look beautiful and to have a body that's thin. And when I think about self-care, I think about like, I'm a swimmer, but all the swimming I do isn't self-care. A lot of it's body maintenance and fitness. Like that's good for you and stuff, but that is not like, when I think about self-care, I think self-care is weaponized against workers. That we're in these unethical situations. So I believe if you stay in ethical work, you can have sustainability. But when what we're doing is driven by a lack of ethics, if we're required to do things that are unethical, like turn people out of shelters, then what we experience is spiritual pain. It's not burnout. It's not, self-care is not going to make you feel better about turning a young woman away from a shelter in the middle of the night, nor should it. If a bubble bath and a massage make you feel better about that, you're in the wrong work, right? But I do think there's a place for self-care. It's I think about self-care, and this I talk about with Jill Faulkner. We have a solidarity talk on my website that's called Self-Care. Absolutely essential and essentially inadequate. You have to do enough self-care to have containment of yourself so that you can get yourself out of the way. And when you're talking with people in distress and under attack, it can be about them. That's what self-care is for. But self-care doesn't do anything about the lack of ethics in our work, right? And so when I look at the self-care industry, I'm really alarmed by this because it's this individualistic project, as if you took care of your body and your spirit, you're going to be okay doing unethical things. You ought not to be doing that. Audre Lorde says that self-care is self-preservation. And speaking as a Black queer woman, she said self-care is actually an act of warfare because, as Audre Lorde says elsewhere, she, meaning Black women, were never meant to survive. So, you know, I think self-care, there's a really good place for it, but the pieces that are self-care for me are self-care is a practice that is spiritual and sacred, where you are reconnecting with yourself in some way. And I think about the word recreation, to recreate yourself. Self-care practices should actually be some kind of sacred space where you're actually recreating yourself. It's not getting your nails done necessarily, right?
But actually, what you just mentioned led into my next question around the language that we're used to using around grief and loss. When we spoke previously, you talked about mutual aid, you talked about solidarity work. And I think these are terms that are coined in the sector and kind of just, you know, used in a signature in solidarity. So I was just really interested in hearing what that really means to you and connecting that to the language that we use around grief and loss and how we can unpack that.
Thanks for that. So I think grief and loss are the wrong words because they line up with grief and loss psychology, which has got like kind of a developmental stages approach to it. You know, the first stage is to manage your anger. And the second stage is to come to some kind of level of acceptance. And then you move through these things to move through your grief. But we didn't lose our dog or our father. It's not one event. We are mourning amidst atrocity. There is no time to reflect. We can't even go to all of the memorials that we should be running. And so you can't mourn in the midst of atrocity because, as Emma Goldman says, you got to pray for the dead and fight like hell for the living. We're still in the next battle for the next person to stay alive. So this idea that you have to like do your grief work, step back and do your loss work, you can't do that when you're mourning amidst atrocity. Atrocity names the fact that this is not grief as we know it to be a human experience. I think it's really important to discern the difference between death that is a life task, death that is dignified and respectful and spiritual and cultural. My father died at 89, surrounded by his grandchildren, his family, after a long, gorgeous life that was imperfect and lovely and horrible and everything. And, you know, like respected by everybody. At last rites, the priest said to him, Bill, you were born in a circle of love. You're going to die in a circle of love. That is a respectful, dignified death. That is death as part of our life task. And our society has gotten out of the business of death. But different from that death as a life task is death that's tragic. And there is an absolute discernment for that. When we talk about grief and loss, we're often talking about death that's just natural deaths. This isn't what happens when we're up against these tragic deaths. And these are deaths that result from bad drug policy. These aren't overdoses. These aren't even poisonings. That language is too empty. That talks to you chemically about what may have stopped the body working, but it doesn't speak to the necropolitics, right? Mbembe's ideas of necropolitics, policies that actually kill people. And then I'm really informed by Ruth Gilmore Wilson's ideas. She's a Black abolitionist, speaking about structural and targeted abandonment. Who is left to die? Who is left outside of the beautiful Canadian project of social Medicare, which is something we should fight to keep. But let's not fool ourselves in the mythology that everyone has equal access to this care. They don't, right? There are people who are targeted for abandonment, right? That's structural. So when I think about, you know, grief and loss work and that people need to move through their grief and loss, that's not the situation that we're in. We're in a situation where people are actually being targeted for death by necropolitics, strategic and targeted abandonment by, by drug policy that's actually killing people. And so to respond, it's a gaslighting, right? Gaslighting being like a traditionally thinking about gaslighting as men who are abusive and abusing power, driving women crazy, telling them, no, honey, I already gave you $20, or you made that for dinner last night, lying to women so they go crazy and can't believe their own experience that they're real. But I think all of our workers are being gaslit. And the gaslighting is in the province of British Columbia. I think it's been 8 or 9 years now that we're in a provincial health emergency around the opiate deaths, but I don't see it. I don't know if you do, because when the second health emergency, COVID, came down, there were billions of dollars coming down, care for everybody, because these were innocent victims, right? And so it's gaslighting for our folks. People feel like this is over. And the gaslighting with all the current attack on all harm reduction, right? To say that people are choosing that this is a life choice that people have made and stuff. So I think our grief and loss is really exacerbated by the fact that workers are being put in gaslighting situations, which I believe are, quote, crazy making situations, right? Yeah. And then the other thing I think that's happening is we are putting workers in an existential crisis, which says this: there is nothing natural about this. When AIDS hit, I remember AIDS, right? I was living in Botswana in Southern Africa when AIDS hit, and my country, Botswana, ended up having the highest infection rate in the world at one time. The newspaper the day I left Botswana said, Botswana does not have AIDS because we're a Christian country and we don't have homosexuals. And that kind of hate politics led directly to having the highest levels of infection in the world, right? So I remember AIDS, but it was, remind ourselves, it was a decade before we knew what AIDS was, what was killing people. And then it was 8 more years before we had medication. This catastrophe that we're in, we predicted this. When 2,000 people in Vancouver died of China white over 20 years ago, there were protests. What did we call for? Legalized, decriminalization, safe supply of substance, housing, getting the police out of this, and giving people the help they needed, and respect and dignity. We asked for everything we needed now. So what's happening that's an existential crisis for workers is we're telling everybody, this is not real. This is not a health emergency. This is an emergency of necropolitics and bad drug policy. So this is not normal. And be prepared to work in it every day. And now some workers have been working in it for 8 years. Like I have supervised workers at shelters and housing who they're shelter workers. They're not working at an overdose prevention site. And they've had to overturn 18 overdoses in a day on one shift, while they're being told this isn't real. This isn't a health emergency. This is a drug policy emergency, right? This kind of gaslighting of people. So I think when we offer workers grief and loss counseling, it can be a precariously unethical thing to do, because it defines the workers if they're somehow broken or mentally ill or suffering from grief or loss, and that they have to work through these stages of grief, when in fact, this is a political problem, right? That the answer lies not in necessarily, and I'm not, if you go into counseling and it helps you, that's fantastic. I mean, I'm a therapist, I'm not against it, but this is not an issue of workers not doing their grief and loss work. This is an issue of mourning amidst atrocity, right? Yeah. Cassandra, I'm wondering what you're thinking of what I kind of laid out there.
I think a lot of what you said reflects the experiences of frontline workers that I've worked with myself, and just having to keep going during a crisis that we're really not aware of, like how serious it is, because we're continuing to move. And then when we stop, we find out about the numbers, we find out about like who we haven't connected with, finding out where they are, and that grief that we experience, not really being able to name it, but having to continue to navigate through these spaces and work. It's traumatic in itself, right? And I think it's really important to call out practices that aren't conducive with healing, that are more conducive with making organizations or folks feel like they're doing the work on behalf of their employees and it really not manifesting, like saying we've offered extra hours for self-care. What does that really mean? And how is that an offering to workers who are experiencing grief, losing their colleagues, losing their family, losing their community members, and then working through the pandemic as well, and seeing the response and the support around COVID in comparison to, and you said the China white crisis, like that was 20 years ago. We're
Yeah.
looking at that, and there's no correlation between the responses even equating to the fact that these are lives lost. Let's just respond to the fact that
Yeah.
we're losing lives and not judging those who have passed. Like it's just, there was a lot that I took out of what you said, but it really resonates with the experiences of people who continue to do this work and know that there are people. And I think there was a quote that got me pretty emotional where it's like we're fighting for the ones that are still here
Yeah.
as we continue to speak the names of those that we've lost because we can't forget them, right? And we continue to fight to save the lives of the ones of people that are still here. So yeah, just thank you for that. And yeah, it resonated with me a lot because there's a lot that I'm still trying to understand when
Yeah.
it comes to how I can support others in the work. And I don't want to use language that isn't helpful.
So, what I think about is this language of vicarious trauma and burnout, which is what is being used to describe what's happening to workers. For me, that does a bunch of things that are really particular and important. It invisibilizes the social context of necropolitics, structural abandonment, and hate. And it locates the problem inside of individual workers, to get back to your point again, Seth, about the individualism that's rampant. And individualism hangs out with capitalism and heteropatriarchy and colonization. It's there also, you can't pull one out, But this idea that there are workers who are getting burned out or have vicarious trauma because they're missing something like resiliency or some particular quality. And that's not, for me, I'm really concerned about that, because this language of vicarious trauma and burnout and compassion fatigue, they're all mental illness diagnosis. So I think the trauma industry has a lot to answer for. They've been extremely successful. We don't talk about our people we work alongside, our participants, as being oppressed, as being incarcerated, as surviving colonization and ongoing genocidal practices. Riel Dupley Rossi, who's a two-spirit associate of mine and someone I hold a great deal of respect for, Riel always talks about genocide as ongoing and attempted. And for me as a white settler to always think about it's ongoing, things like the apprehension of Indigenous children, the incarceration of Aboriginal people, the forced sterilization of Aboriginal folks, ongoing practices. But then also that it's only attempted because, like Audre Lorde said, we were not meant to survive. Indigenous people are still here. So when I think about, we used to be able to name things like violence, attack, oppression. Now all of that's covered with the word trauma. Well, that word obscures a lot more than it reveals, so that you can have trauma from being in a car accident or from responding to 3 overdoses where you're breathing air into someone who's dead. These are not the same events. As and as if all that matters is the psychological trauma, so now what are your, what are the behaviors, what are the criteria that you're doing that meets up with that? So I'm concerned about us talking about workers as if they're mentally ill somehow, because if you think the problem is mental illness, it's located in the brain, in particular in the neurons. If you think the problem is in the brain of workers, then you're going to try to get a better drug or a better tool and fix that brain. If you think that that problem is in the social world, you're going to do something to create a more just society, right? I think the best thing you could do for all workers right now is listen to drug users, listen to the people who are called peers and people with lived and living experience are saying, we want a safe supply of drugs. That's what would end this, right? But we're not listening to those folks. So when I think about the language of vicarious trauma and burnout being a psychological language of deficit, the way workers are broken, you can see how this totally obscures the political environment in which stuff is happening. So what I believe, and vicarious trauma, just one quote about it, is that clients infect us with hopelessness, that it vicariously lands on you. Trauma vicariously lands on you. There's a transmission of traumatic shock is another way psychologists talk about it. I don't think about it that way. I've been supervising for over 3 decades in all kinds of environments, responding basically to political violence and oppression. And I think that if we know that what we are doing collectively is ethical, we can have sustainability. And sustainability is something very different than not burning out. But if what we're required to do is unethical, like tell someone they can't come to an overdose prevention site anymore because they called somebody a cunt, so they're gone, they're not getting services anymore. Like if you're the person who's saying, no, sorry, Joe, you're going to lose a loan and die now because you behaved so badly, or whatever, you know, someone losing their bed at a shelter, whatever that practice is. If you're the worker doing that and you have to treat somebody unethically and they die as a result of it, that's not burnout or vicarious trauma. That client did not infect you with hopelessness, right? I believe that that is spiritual pain or an ethical pain. I think that's what our workers are struggling with. We know why people come to this work. We know what's at the heart of people's work. Nobody here couldn't get a job doing something else. They want to be here. They've got lived and living experience. They've got spiritual and ethical commitments. They want to give back. They, you know, people, they want to do the right thing if they have privilege. People come for all the right reasons, and then they're required to do things that are unethical because of policies, budgeting, all kinds of stuff. And I think what they experience is not vicarious trauma, but better understood as spiritual pain or ethical pain, right? And the reality is you can't keep yourself ethical. Collective, no amount of self-care, no amount of yoga or doing plank or drinking water is going to keep you ethical. Ethics are something we have to build collectively. Our collective ethics are what matters. And the other thing is we're going to lose the plot. So we're going to need each other. Part of our collective care, Seff, is having the moral courage to offer critique to each other and say, hey, what you're doing is not on. It's not a group hug and donuts. It's the tough stuff. Having the moral courage to keep clients at the center and be rigorous about what we're doing and resist bad policy. It's not easy. It's not easy work.